The doctor said the memory loss was temporary, and they were right. What they didn't tell me was that getting it back would be the most dangerous thing that ever happened to me. It started 3 months after the accident. A pickup truck ran a red light on Route 9 and hit my driver's side door at 40 miles an hour. I was 63 years old, retired from 28 years as a civil engineer for the county, and I was on my way to pick up a prescription, just an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I woke up in the ICU 2 days later. My son was there. My daughter was there. My son-in-law was there. Everyone looked relieved, which I appreciated. What I didn't understand at the time was that some of that relief had nothing to do with me. The neurologist explained it as retrograde amnesia combined with some anterograde disruption. In plain English, I had trouble forming new memories, and I had lost chunks of the recent past. The month before the accident was mostly gone. Random things from the years before that would surface and disappear like objects caught in a tide. I knew who people were. I knew my own name, Martin. I knew I had 2 grown kids, a house in Denton, Texas, a truck that apparently no longer existed, and a pension that hit my checking account on the 1st of every month. What I couldn't reliably do was follow a conversation from beginning to end and hold on to it. My daughter would tell me something in the morning, and by afternoon it had dissolved. She started keeping a small whiteboard on the kitchen counter. Dad ate breakfast. Dad's PT is at 2. Dad asked about Mom again. My wife had passed 4 years before the accident. Ovarian cancer. Her name was Ruth, and I remembered everything about her with perfect clarity. That part of my brain had been left alone. My nephew stood in my living room and told me that my house next week. I'm Robert. On preset, it made more sense for her to stay. I thought it was a kindness. She set up the spare bedroom with her things, started cooking my meals, managing my medications, driving me to appointments. Her husband came on weekends. My son called from Nashville every few days. He worked in logistics, long hours, 2 kids of his own. He couldn't just pick up and come. I want to be clear about something. I was not helpless. I could walk, dress myself, carry on a conversation in the moment. I wasn't confused about where I was or who I was. The damage was specific. The recording function, the neurologist called it. My brain had trouble writing new things to long-term storage. It was like having a perfectly good library with a broken intake disc. But I understand how it looked from the outside. I understand how easy it was for people to assume that because I forgot, I also couldn't perceive. Those are not the same thing. The memory started coming back gradually around month 3. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where lights switched on. It was more like the fog thinning at the edges first, then the middle. I started retaining conversations overnight, then over 2 days, then a week. I noticed it before I said anything to anyone because the neurologist had told me that the recovery would be uneven and not to get too excited about good days. So I waited. I watched. This is where I need to tell you about the house. Ruth and I had bought the house in 1991. 3 bedrooms, a good-sized yard, a workshop in the back where I built furniture on weekends. We'd raised both kids there. After Ruth died, I had some hard conversations with myself about whether to stay, and I decided I would. I wasn't ready to leave the place where she'd hung her coats and kept her garden. The house was paid off. It was worth, in last appraisal, somewhere around $420,000. I had a modest investment account, the pension, and Social Security. By any reasonable measure, I was fine. Not wealthy, but fine. Ruth and I had always lived within our means. My daughter and her husband, as I was beginning to piece together, were not fine. I didn't learn this all at once. I learned it the way you learn most things when someone thinks you can't remember, in fragments, scattered across days, none of it directed at you. A phone call she took in the kitchen while I was in the living room. A conversation with her husband at the dining room table when they assumed I was asleep. A document left face up on the counter for a half-second before she turned it over. The first thing I caught clearly was about the medical evaluation. This was roughly a week after I realized my memory was reliably coming back, and I hadn't yet told anyone. I was sitting in my recliner with the television on low, and my daughter was in the kitchen on the phone. I heard my name, then the words cognitive assessment and legally incapacitated. I didn't move. I kept my eyes on the television. She lowered her voice, but the house has good acoustics. Ruth always said the living room carried sound from everywhere. She said, the neurologist already documented the memory issues. We just need an independent evaluation that confirms he can't manage his own affairs. I sat with that for the rest of the evening. Over the following 2 weeks, I listened. I kept my expression the same, a little vague, a little slow. When I forgot things on purpose, my daughter would exchange a look with her husband that I recognized. The look said, "Good, still working as expected." Here is what I learned. They were in serious financial trouble. Her husband's business, some kind of residential remodeling operation, had been struggling for 2 years. They had taken out a second mortgage on their own house. They were behind. The numbers I caught in pieces were not small. Their plan, as I understood it, was to have me declared legally incapacitated. Once that happened, my daughter would petition for guardianship. Guardianship would give her control over my finances and my property. She could then sell the house, my house, Ruth's house, and use the proceeds to cover their debt. I would be moved to a memory care facility. There was a specific one she'd mentioned to her husband, about 20 miles away, mid-range. Not the cheapest one, she said, but not the nicest either. Medicare and my pension would cover most of it. What struck me wasn't even the audacity of it. What struck me was how practical they'd made it sound, like they were solving a logistics problem, like I was a logistics problem. I thought about Ruth. I thought about what she would say if she could see this. I knew exactly what she would say, because I'd known her for 38 years and she did not tolerate dishonesty in any form. She would have been devastated. Not angry, that was my lane, but genuinely, quietly devastated. She loved our daughter without reservation. I called my son on a Thursday morning when my daughter had gone out to run errands. I told him everything. I walked him through it as methodically as I could, date by date, conversation by conversation. There was a long silence on his end of the line. He said, "Dad, are you sure? Because that's—" "I'm sure," I said. "My memory came back about 3 weeks ago. I've been listening." Another silence. "Then how bad is it? How solid is what you heard?" "Solid enough that I know the name of the facility they picked out," I said. I told him the name. He let out a long breath. "Okay," he said. "Okay. We need to talk to someone, a lawyer." I'd already thought of that. I had a name, an estate attorney Ruth and I had used when we updated our wills after she got sick. I asked my son to call him first, to explain the situation and see what options I had. I didn't want to make a move until I understood what I was doing. The attorney's name was Philip. Wade, no. I need to use his real name, the one I've been calling him for 15 years. His name was Stewart, and he was 61 years old and the most careful man I've ever met with a sentence. He did not say anything he didn't mean, and he didn't mean anything he hadn't thought through. When my son called him, he cleared his afternoon. Stewart told my son that the key was timing and documentation. If they moved forward with the competency evaluation before I did anything, I would be on defense. But if I acted first, updated my legal documents, potentially recorded conversations where the plan was being discussed, I had real options. Texas is a one-party consent state for recordings. I did not know this before my son told me. It means that as long as one person in a conversation consents to being recorded, the recording is legal. I was one person. I consented. I bought a small digital recorder at a Walmart on a day my daughter drove me to what she thought was just a routine follow-up. I had her drop me at the entrance, said I'd call when I was done, walked in the front door and out the side, caught a rideshare to the store, and was back in the waiting room before she pulled back around. It was the first time in 3 months I'd done something entirely on my own, and it felt like standing up straight after a long time hunched over. I didn't have to wait long for what I needed. 6 days after I got the recorder, her husband came for what was supposed to be a regular weekend visit. That Saturday evening I went to bed early, which I'd made a habit of, and I set the recorder on the small shelf on my side of the bedroom wall, the wall that backed up to the dining room. The acoustics in this house, as I mentioned, have always been generous. They talked for a long time. I lay there in the dark and listened to my daughter and her husband discuss my future like they were dividing up a joint checking account. He was pushing for moving faster. He said the evaluation needed to happen soon, that their lender had given them a hard deadline. She said she needed another few weeks to make sure the documentation was strong. He said, "What documentation?" And she said the calendar she'd been keeping, a daily log of things I'd forgotten, things I'd gotten confused about. She'd been keeping a log. The whole time she'd been caring for me, she'd been building a case. I lay there and felt something I don't have a perfect word for. It wasn't quite rage. Rage runs hot, and this was cold. It was the feeling of understanding completely, for the first time, the full shape of a thing you'd only partially seen. The next morning was Sunday. My daughter made eggs. Her husband watched football. I sat at the kitchen table and drank my coffee and talked about the weather, about whether the Cowboys had any chance this season, about a neighbor's new fence. I was very good by this point. 3 months of practice. My son flew in from Nashville on Wednesday, which was not unusual. He'd visited twice since the accident. But this time he came with Stuart, who I introduced to my daughter as an old friend. She was polite. She had no reason to be otherwise. We had the conversation in my workshop, the three of us, while my daughter was inside making lunch. The door to the workshop locks from the inside. Stuart walked me through what he'd prepared, a new power of attorney, naming my son, a new will. There had been some changes to make. A letter to my bank officially designating my son as co-account holder, a formal notification to my neurologist that I was invoking my right to have my medical records and treatment decisions managed by myself and my designated representative. I signed everything. I also gave Stuart the recorder. He transferred the files and listened to the relevant portions with an expression that didn't change, but whose stillness communicated a great deal. He said he would keep the files and that I should keep a copy somewhere outside the house. My son held onto a copy on his phone. We went back inside for lunch. The conversation with my daughter happened 2 days later, after her husband had gone home. I asked her to sit down at the kitchen table. She did, and something in the way she looked at me, a quick assessment, recalibrating, told me she sensed something had shifted. I told her my memory had come back. I told her when. I told her what I'd heard. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because I've gone over it many times, and I don't want to be unfair. She cried. That part was real. Whether it was grief or fear or the specific anguish of being caught, I can't tell you for certain. Probably some mixture. She said she'd only been trying to make sure I was taken care of. She said she'd been scared watching me struggle. She said the financial problems were real and she'd been desperate and she knew it was wrong. I listened to all of it. I had the recorder running. I told her that I understood she was in trouble. I told her that what she'd been planning, a fraudulent competency claim, a guardianship built on manufactured evidence, was not trouble. It was something considerably more serious. I told her I'd spoken with an attorney. I told her I had recordings. I told her she needed to leave my house that day. She left. I called my son that evening, and we talked for a long time. He cried too. This family has done a lot of crying this year. The financial situation with my daughter and her husband eventually resolved itself in the way those things do, badly and slowly, but resolved. They sold their house. They downsized. I was not part of any of that. I stayed in my house. I'm still in my house. The workshop is still in the back. Last month I finished a dining table I'd started before the accident and never gotten back to white oak, breadboard ends, hand-cut mortise and tenon joints. Ruse would have put a runner on it and a bowl of something in the center. I leave it bare. My nephew sat in my living room and told me the bank was foreclosing on my house next week. We're in the backyard. His kids like the workshop, and I'm teaching the older one, who is 12, how to use a hand plane. My daughter and I have had 2 phone calls since she left. Short ones. We are not where we were, and I don't know if we'll get back there. I'm not carrying anger about it anymore. That's not something I want to be carrying at 64. But trust doesn't rebuild on a schedule, and I'm not going to pretend it does. What I think about most, oddly, is that Tuesday afternoon on Route 9. The ordinary errand. The red light that someone didn't honor. The gap between one life and the next that can open up in under a second. I was supposed to be defenseless. I was supposed to forget everything and disappear quietly into someone else's plan for me. Instead, the fog lifted and I could see, and I had the presence of mind to wait and watch and move carefully. Ruth always said I was too deliberate, that I thought too long before acting. This once, at least, she would have agreed with my timing. I think about that dining table sometimes, the one I finished last month. White oak, hand-cut joints. The kind of work that takes patience and doesn't forgive mistakes. Ruth would have put something beautiful on it. I'll leave it bare. That's the whole story right there, if you know how to read furniture. What happened to me wasn't a tragedy. I know that sounds strange given everything, but I've turned it over enough times now that I can say it plainly. The accident, the memory loss, all of it. It forced a kind of clarity I probably never would have found otherwise. You don't know what's been growing in the dark until something strips away the ordinary noise of daily life and you're left just listening. That's the thing about integrity. The real kind, not the version people perform for an audience. My daughter wasn't a monster. She was a person under pressure who made a choice and then made another choice and then built a whole architecture of smaller choices until she'd constructed something she couldn't walk back from easily. I've watched enough people over 63 years to know that's how most harm gets done. Not in one dramatic moment, but in 100 quiet ones, each one a little easier than the last because the previous one already moved the line. I don't think I'm better than her. I've been under pressure in my life. I've made choices I'm not proud of. What I had, and what I think saved me, was the discipline to slow down when everything in me wanted to react. When I first understood what she was planning, my instinct was to walk into that kitchen and end it right there, loud and immediate. Instead, I waited 3 weeks. I documented. I called a lawyer. I moved carefully through a situation that could have destroyed me if I'd let my anger run ahead of my judgment. That kind of discipline. The ability to think clearly when the stakes are personal and the wound is fresh, that doesn't come from nowhere. It's built. Ruth used to say I was too deliberate. For most of my life, I thought she might be right. Turns out deliberate was exactly what the situation required. And then there's the matter of what you do after. The easy version of this story ends with justice served and the villain gone and the protagonist riding off satisfied. The harder truth is that my daughter is still my daughter. Those phone calls we've had, short, careful, like 2 people on opposite sides of a frozen pond testing the ice, those matter to me. I'm not carrying anger, but I'm also not pretending the ice is solid when I can hear it creak. What I want, if I'm honest, is for her to find her way back to the person she was before the money trouble hollowed something out in her. It's not forgiveness in any grand sense. It's just what a father wants. You spend 30-some years loving someone, and that doesn't switch off because they gave you a reason to stop trusting them. Martin's story, my story, is about what happens when you refuse to disappear quietly. When you stay present, stay clear, and trust that doing the right thing slowly is still doing the right thing. The table is bare. The workshop is open. My grandson is 12 and learning how to use a hand plane, and he's got good instincts for the grain. That's enough. That's more than enough.